I'm going to start off this video by telling a little story and how I actually got into Bloodborne. Back in 2015, I was working a job with a really crappy pay. I was making like £3 an hour and I was a year out of college, so to say money was a tad tight would be an understatement. At the time, I was playing a lot of Dark Souls 2 and I knew about Bloodborne, but I didn't have a PlayStation 4. I was, and still am, primarily a PC gamer, so I had to answer the question, do I buy a console just for one game? It was the day before release and I still hadn't made up my mind yet, so I rang my local game store and asked if they'll be having a midnight release for Bloodborne. They said no, but I should hurry because they only have so many copies and they're expecting the game to sell out in the first hour. So I said, right, that's it, I'm doing it. Again, if you watched my previous video, you know how awful I am with money. But off I went at 7 AM into town, ready to be the first one in line for Bloodborne and my shiny new PlayStation 4. Obviously, my train was delayed by about 45 minutes because, well, this is England, so I arrived at the store about an hour after it opened, and it was dead. Hundreds of copies lined the shelves and not a soul was in sight. The guy on the phone baited the shit out of me. Fast forward a couple of weeks and I finished the game. Now I normally get insane buyer's remorse for pretty much anything I buy, but when I finished the game, I thought it was worth every penny. Now some will argue a game will never be worth a whole console, and well, that might be the case for you, but here it was different. It was such a refined PvE experience with such attention to detail, an incredible soundtrack and fun combat, which was welcomed after the lackluster Dark Souls 2 PvE, but Bloodborne hit those right notes. For me, it nearly had everything going against it. I didn't like the setting when I saw the trailers, I didn't want to spend the money on an entire new console, but I did anyway. Bloodborne had an uphill climb in order to impress me and feel as though I got my money's worth, and it succeeded on nearly every single front. Today we're going to talk about those areas of the game that I felt fell short or could have been improved upon. Some of these will be quite nitpicky, so here's your warning. To me, Bloodborne is near perfect, so I had to dig somewhat deep when thinking about issues with the game. So, without further ado, let's explore what went wrong with Bloodborne. Right off the gate, I want to tackle the way lanterns function in the game. Lanterns are your way back to the Hunter's Dream, which is the game's hub system that lets you buy items, level up and access the other areas. Much like the Arkstones and Nexus in Demon's Souls, the frustrating thing about the lanterns in Bloodborne is you can't sit or rest at them and reset the area much like you can in Dark Souls. Instead, you're thrust into a loading screen. Now, for example, let's say you want to teleport to another location, you'd have to sit through 2 loading screens to arrive at your destination. Back when Bloodborne first came out, this was more of an issue than it already is. The vanilla Bloodborne loading screens could have been up to a minute long, so if you had to go through 2 of those bad boys, it could get quite frustrating. Nowadays, the loading screens aren't too bad at all, but I still prefer to be able to rest at the lamp and travel from it without having to travel back to the dream. The only time you'll really notice this if you're farming for blood vials, which we'll get onto later, or farming in general. This is a slight inconvenience in the long run, but I felt it prevalent enough to be mentioned here. The way Bloodborne handles healing is a system that's similar to Demon's Souls and is widely regarded as a worse system compared to the Dark Souls Estus. The way blood vials work is that you can carry up to 20 or more depending on the rooms you choose, and these will dwindle over time. Now you can find these in the world or buy them from the messenger shop, but this is an inconvenience. As the blood vials deplete, instead of the tension I'd assume FromSoftware was trying to create by having your healing items deplete over time, it turns into what only can be described as forced frustration. You know you're going to have to spend time farming or spending blood echoes on healing items if you're out, and I don't think this was the intended purpose. As I mentioned, I feel as though this system is supposed to add tension and suspense as you traverse through a level. Sounds good on paper, but when put into practice it's quite annoying for a player who may already be struggling on a certain area or encounter to then have to worry about running out of healing potential. It punishes those who are already having a hard time, but for me personally, I don't really mind that aspect. For example, in Dark Souls 2, I quite enjoy the lowered health per death. The literal only reason I dislike the healing in Bloodborne is because it has the potential to inflate game time as you're farming for blood vials, and no one likes farming for healing items. But farming for blood gems? Blood gems are items that can be placed in your weapon to give them increased special abilities, for example 20% increased physical damage. The best blood gems in the game can be found deep within the Chalice dungeons. Chalice dungeons are a unique gameplay element to Bloodborne that creates dungeons that players can explore which are somewhat randomized, so you'll get a different experience each time, kind of. Now, I'm actually quite a fan of Chalice dungeons, at least the premise of them. I like turning off my brain and farming for something. That's gameplay I tend to enjoy. But does it belong in a world as detailed as Bloodborne? Well, lore-wise, the Chalice dungeons actually has some pretty substantial amount to whet your appetite. The issue with Chalice dungeons is how they're presented. Each dungeon has generally the same vibe as all of them apart from a few paint jobs here and there. Some have this sandstorm environment and others have this cosmos style, and although they may look aesthetically different, the layout and how you progress is the same all the way through, so to players who don't enjoy grinding or looking at similar environments, it can get quite tedious, I'd imagine. But as I mentioned, I do quite enjoy them, but aren't blind to their flaws. And to do the main Chalice dungeons, the ones you need to do in order to get to the Queen, will take a fair few amount of hours, so it's more content to hack away at. But the repetitive nature can be, well, boring, it's as simple as that. I feel as though they try to counter this by the glyph system, which is how the dungeons are randomly generated. In some glyphs there can be rare monsters and gems which you can stumble upon, which is something really cool about the Chalice dungeons. I mean, we had something recently where the community discovered a previously unknown mob. But learning what you need to enter the Chalice dungeons can be very intimidating for first time players. Figuring out what goes where is challenging. Not only that, but I'm not a fan of how we get into the actual place where the dungeons are located. To get there you have to sit at one of the gravestones in the Hunter's Dream and then get teleported there. Now, I've always compared this to World of Warcraft. Now, hear me out. A big issue with World of Warcraft is there's too many people sitting in the main town, AFK, searching for dungeons, and this removes players from the actual world. I feel it's a similar situation here. Instead of going out into the world of Yharnam and finding the entrance to these dungeons, we sit in the dream and get ported there. So what I'm saying is, if we take the initial Chalice dungeons as an example, instead of simply sitting at a gravestone in the Hunter's Dream, you have to discover the entrance in the initial area of the game. That way players have another reason to go and visit areas they've previously been to and maybe discover things they've potentially missed. Because there's a lot of reasons to backtrack in Bloodborne, so why not give them another one? It's a thought, and it might not be a very good one, but basically I would have liked a system that wasn't just loading up a menu. This to me feels like Chalice dungeons were somewhat tacked on near the end. But if you haven't done them, I'd actually recommend it. There's some cool bosses you can slice up. Speaking of slicing up bosses, the weapons in Bloodborne are fantastic. Yes, there's not many, but the quality over quantity statement is what Bloodborne is in a nutshell. The issue I and many others have is referring to build diversity and the general pacing of the game in reference to builds. In my experience, for a Blood Tinge or an Arcane build to be effective, you're looking at getting to mid to late game to have the right tools for the build. When it comes down to skill or strength, like I said, the weapons are fun and awesome, but there's just not that many. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, pun intended. Do you give the player more weapons and potentially lower the quality of that weapon or weapons, or do you have a select few that are carefully crafted? It's a tough one to answer. For me, I prefer the quality over quantity approach. The only gripe I have with it is you'll run into weapons on a somewhat rare basis in Bloodborne, and that can be an issue when you're leveling your character because you can't reallocate stats. Unfortunately, Bloodborne took a step back from Dark Souls 2 in that regard, and as I mentioned in the Dark Souls 2 video, players can be curious or indecisive when it comes to builds. So without having the ability to reallocate stats, this causes either over leveling, which I did a lot in Bloodborne because of this, or start a new playthrough and tailor your character to that weapon or stat. But with this said, you don't really get that many upgrade materials compared to the Souls games in Bloodborne, unless you use numerous Chalice dungeon glyphs that you can find online, so you can only really level a few weapons to max anyway. So there really is a focus on making sure you like the weapon you're using. When playing through Bloodborne, there's been many times I've been playing through it, grown uninterested with my weapon, found a new one and gone, oh shit, because I have the wrong stats. Hopefully, by now, respecking your character will become common practice in future Souls games FromSoftware create, because when it comes down to it, I just want to play with everything they've created. Now I'm going to talk about my experience with the PvP, and you might have had a different experience, so what I'm about to say might be alien to you, so here it goes. Nearly every single PvP encounter I had in Bloodborne had awful netcode with bad latency, where I'd land a hit and a couple of seconds later it'd go through. Now this could have been an isolated issue, I know, because some people thoroughly enjoyed the PvP, so I don't want to rag on the netcode too much, because like I said, it could have been an issue on my end. But with the way invasions are set up in Bloodborne, it doesn't really have much going for it either. There's only a few select areas where invasions are open, and these being the places where the bell-ringing woman are located at. When a hunter decides to bring in some co-op help, however, a bell-ringing woman will spawn, so you can potentially invade in every single area. The problem is, invasions will obviously favour co-op play, which I guess isn't really a problem, come to think of it. But in a world which has multiple players in, they're more than likely going to rush and kill the bell-ringing woman, which will then silence all potential PvP for that session. I've never really thought of invasions in Bloodborne being that prevalent compared to Dark Souls, and I think it's more focused on the 1v1 dueling. With dedicated PvP Chalice dungeons being set up, you can have fun with PvP, but it's so difficult to come by, and it was a shame really, because on the rare chance I did encounter PvP, it was in the later zones, because typically I don't co-op, and it was plagued with the issues I mentioned earlier. Bloodborne for me, like I said, is a near perfect game, which has some nitpicky issues here and there, but these I don't feel hinder the experience too much. I still to this day love loading it up, listening to that amazing soundtrack and slaying some beasts. Yes, there's the fact it's console exclusive and it sucks, I know, but what can you really do? The dudes have to make money. Also, on the standard PS4, the frame rate can be a bit of a nightmare in certain places, especially after killing the one reborn. It will drop horribly, but other than that, I had to really rack my brain for this one. It's easy to say things are bad. Becomes kind of a challenge trying to explain why and how it could be improved upon, but that's where the fun is really, that's what I enjoy doing. Now there's a couple of things I want to talk about before I head out. Recently, a few people have said my videos include a lot of clickbait, and I'll be the first to admit the Buyer Beware series can be seen as that, and I am looking for other video titles for that series, but the What Went Wrong series is my longest running series on this channel, and it's coming up to being nearly 2 years old. My intention is to never mislead with the titles of my videos, but intrigue the viewer. My hopes is that after you clicked on the video, you got the content that the title was implying. That's been the case since day one. I don't have that large audience who will watch whatever I put up, and if I were to say I don't make the thumbnail and title of the video in the hopes of gaining a larger audience or further reach, I'd be lying. But as I said, I never mislead with the title. When you click on it, you know what you're getting. I know I shouldn't have gotten into it, but I put a lot of work and time into creating these scripts, and it kind of irked me the wrong way when my content gets called clickbait garbage. Because, you know, I'm trying to make good stuff. Anyway, sorry about that, I just thought I'd get into it for a second. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode of What Went Wrong. Take care, be good to one another, and I'll see you next time.